Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to, our good friend, Chris Martenson of peakprosperity.com. He's an economic researcher, writer, and trend forecaster. Chris, welcome back.
Max, such a pleasure to be back with you today.
First of all, I just wanted to ground our discussion a little bit because peak prosperity, it kind of alludes to this idea of peak energy, peak credit, peak. It's like humans have reached the peak carrying capacity of planet Earth to continue as they are doing, as they have been doing. Is that a fair characterization?
That's very fair. It's not like we've almost reached it. We pretty much have. And, the plus side of the story is we've got lots of abundant resources, and this is a fantastic time to be alive. And then the other side of that story is we got to grow up and start managing this planet like it's finite, and humans aren't doing that so far. So there's a lot in this story to suggest, yes, we are at a peak, but there's still plenty we can do. We just need to be a little smarter about what we're doing.
Well, the Earth has infinite resources, but the ability to print money in this neoliberal model is infinite, and you have a problem there. And you write that it's the mother of all bubbles. Elaborate on how exactly did we get to this point? I have a feeling it ties into this money printing, infinite money printing. Chris, what are your thoughts?
We got into this for very human reasons, the same reasons that the Romans debased their denarius and got into a whole lot of trouble, the same reason Weimar Germany got into trouble, Zimbabwe, now Venezuela. It's rooted in this idea, Max, that we can have a free lunch. It's rooted in the idea that we can print prosperity. And people are enthralled with the central bank's ability to print money and throw a big party. And what they're missing in this story is it's just not possible. Last week, I was down talking with pension managers. These are all people managing pensions. They're absolutely, they don't know what to do because growth isn't quite there, and they're just getting killed in the markets. They can't meet their fiduciary responsibilities. Why? Well, because the Federal Reserve took interest rates down to zero, and so did all the central banks of the world. And they did that to try and keep the party going a little longer, but it's creating enormous strains. It threw Granny under the bus. And when I say the mother of all bubbles, this is a bubble born in the late 70s, early 80s, around this one idea that you can expand credit at twice the rate that your economy is growing, and that we could do that forever. Hey, sixth graders can work it out. That's a bad math problem. It doesn't work out, and we're still all pretending it does. So yeah, peak prosperity. We're a little bit of the emperor has no clothes. That's the business line we're in.
We talk about printing money, the expansion of the credit market, the money growing at a multiple of underlying GDP growth or underlying inflation even, and this creates a huge collision course. But there's a couple of other aspects to it, and you talked a little bit about there. There's also some thieving or theft going on. In other words, you've got a huge piles of money in pension accounts. They were paying 5 or 6%, which would be a normalized rate of return. But by the Federal Reserve Bank taking interest rates close to zero, they've effectively moved that pool of money to speculators on Wall Street to keep the bubble going. The second thing I would add is that some countries are targeted for destruction, like Greece, for example, where it's looted and that money is stolen, and again, to feed the bubble. Would you agree with those two ideas?
I absolutely would. And that first point you made, Max, so important and so very rarely made, which is that the Federal Reserve didn't print up prosperity. It looks like it. We're seeing it in the top 0.1%. Remember last year, Oxfam runs this report and says, wow, 62 people have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. Well, this year that number is 8, right? How did we get there? It's like people talk about it like it's this mysterious process. They got there because the Federal Reserve took money from everybody who was getting interest income, savers, retirees, pensions, and transferred it to another place. The Federal Reserve and other central banks, most important point you made here, they don't create wealth, but they do move it. And they moved it away from savers, from the prudent, from the people who need it, from retirees, from Granny, and gave it to the big banks and the speculators, because that's what the Federal Reserve and other central banks thought was a really good idea. Well, clearly it's not a good idea. It's a horrible idea. And I'm not buying Janet Yellen's kindly grandmother act. I think she's actually one of the most destructive people on the planet.
Now, when you talk to economists, they discuss economic policy and interest rates in terms of their models. and they have volumes of books to refer to and number of economists to weigh in with their thoughts. At the same time, though, these low interest rates have engendered a crime spree in the banking system in America and around the world. And by crime, I mean underwriting massive drug cartels in Mexico in the case of HSBC, or other banks in the UK and America underwriting massive fraud. JP Morgan paying billions and billions of dollars in penalties for fraud and for actions that are illegal. The cost of the fraud goes down. If you're JP Morgan, you're Jamie Dimon, and you're a serial fraudster, instead of the government coming in and trying to convince you to stop breaking the law, they lower the rate at which you're borrowing money to commit the fraud. So they're enabling the fraud. It's almost as if fraud is the business model and anything else gets pushed aside.
If it looks like fraud, smells like fraud, it's probably fraudulent. We have a fraudulent system right now. And the primary fraud that exists under all of this is the idea that you can get something for nothing. Now, it used to be, I come from a long line of bankers, regional bankers. My great-great-grandfather started one where he had, I think because he was tired of carrying cash around in his beaver felt hat or whatever, way back in the 1800s in upstate New York. Banking used to be this kind of risky but low-paying sort of a job. It was about 4% of the economy. Well, fast forward, today it's 40% of the economy, and we had under Eric Holder enshrined this principle under Obama that you can't prosecute these big banks because they're too big to fail, too big to jail. If we did it, it would create systemic risk. How did we get to the point? What befell us that we got to the point where we said, wow, the fraud is too big to contain. I guess we just got to let it run, because if we take the fraud out, the whole system falls apart. I mean, it's kind of like a circular reasoning, but it's kind of admitting that the whole system's a fraud when you say we can't even stop the fraud because it would break the fraud train. I mean, people know this, and that's why Brexit is happening, and you're looking at Marine Le Pen rise, and you're looking at the difficulties in Greece, and also I think soon Italy. When you look at what's happening with Donald Trump being elected, all of these are saying that we the people, that's the 99.9%, we the people are feeling the shocks from this. Our economic oxygen has been sucked out. And there, I think if we take one big step back and say, well, wait a minute, what's happening? The pie can't expand like it used to, and it can't because the resources don't exist anymore to do that. We're entering a whole new future. That's what my work is about, is trying to help people understand that new future. But how it used to work is not how it can work, but we're still running the same fraud practices that used to work when resources were abundant, only now it's the pie isn't growing fast enough for everybody to have oxygen in this story, and that's why it's becoming so politically painful too.
Well, to your point that the fraud begets more fraud, and it becomes the definition of the system instead of a byproduct of the system. It's like that old Woody Allen joke where he goes to the doctor and says, "Doc, my brother thinks he's a chicken." The doctor says, "Here, give him these pills." And he says, "No, you don't understand. We need the eggs." Right? So it's a joke about how a delusion becomes the norm. And in this case, it's financial delusion supported by what is essentially a Ponzi scheme, supported by natural resources. And those natural resources are running out. And without those natural resources. But it appears to me, Chris, that the bankers are trying to mine our collective unconscious, not to take too large a leap and digress too much. But when you hear companies like Facebook or social media companies, they are cultivating and farming people. People sign up to a Facebook, and then their data and their activities, their thoughts are sold and resold, and Facebook becomes a $400 billion company. They don't have a product per se, but they farm humans' thoughts, and they sell it to advertisers. So this is where the environment, if you will, has gone from physical Earth to a virtual plane of existence. And Goldman Sachs is right there. They will issue virtual reality collateralized bonds to service this market. It seems as though they've already acquiesced to the fact that humans can go extinct, but as long as we have a memes somewhere in our computer systems, we can still maintain the charade. Your thoughts?
Well, honestly, if a neutron bomb went off and every human died right now, I bet you the computers would still be trading shares of Facebook, back and forth and driving the price up, probably. I wrote a really important article probably 3 months ago, and it's called "We're Being Played." And there I went all the way back to the Edward Bernays treatise back of 1928, which talked about how to run effective propaganda. Now, this was 1928, and they had already begun to work through how you go about shaping the consent of the masses and implanting ideas and creating what you called a meme, which is an idea that self-replicates, it self-reinforces, and next thing you know, it's true. Even though if you talk to somebody about it, they're certain it's true. Like today's meme is Russia is evil and they hacked the US election, right? Most people I talk to about that, you scratch at that a little bit and they have no data under that. They're just certain of this truth. And so that's an interesting process how these truths get inserted. And yes, Facebook has a role in this now. What we know about the human wiring, about ourselves as biological organisms, how to go about manufacturing this consent, it's almost quaint what they were talking about in 1928, and they were pretty good at it. Today, we're exquisite at it. And so I wrote this article called We're Being Played to open people's eyes up to the idea that we don't just sell ourselves soap, although we're really good at that. We don't just sell cars, we sell ideas. We sell things that aren't necessarily good for us to ourselves, and people consume them because we've become so good at consuming. We know how to do that. We're born and bred for that. And so what I feel happening in my own life, and this is exciting, this is the good side of the story, is in particular young people are waking up to this and going, I don't want any part of this. I don't get it. The story doesn't make sense. So I have a sense of the status quo desperately clinging to a failing narrative and other people beginning to wake up faster and faster going, that's broken story. I don't agree to that one, but I don't know what to do yet. So we're in that uncomfortable period of having that old story falling apart, not having a good one that we can sort of rally around yet, but that's coming.
You're talking about Bernays and the art of persuasion and what became the model for modern propaganda. It required a big apparatus. It required a huge media footprint. Manufacturing consent under a Noam Chomsky model requires a large media apparatus. But this new memosphere and this new collective unconscious mining, you have the benefit of people willfully giving up all of their personal data and all of their interactions. The problem that the propagandists have is mining all the data they're being given for free. In other words, they're trying to drink from a fire hose, and there's no end to it. But anyway, we have to cut it off here, and hopefully you can stick around for another segment if that's possible.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Chris Martenson. He's an economist, researcher, writer, and trend forecaster of peakprosperity.com. If you want to reach us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.